Hello everyone, and welcome back to the final part of Chapter 18, Lecture 3. We are moving on to the adrenal gland and going through its histology and pinpointing the hormones released at each spot here. So we'll be breaking that down in full details here, and then we'll end with, of course, adrenal gland imbalances, kind of like what we did with the thyroid gland, and talk about some of those imbalances. So let's move on here. As you can see, these are our typical objectives. If you wanted to look these over, I suggest you pause the video now. But I am going to just kind of move right on because we've been rolling through and we'll keep rolling on here. Alright, so we're moving on to section 18-6 here. We are on to the adrenal gland. Certainly in class, you should be able to recognize a model and know that the top of the kidney represents the adrenal gland here, has this yellowish adipose looking color because, of course, we're dealing with steroid derivatives, which are going to be made up of lipids. So the adrenal glands, they're located superior to each kidney. Sort of a easy anatomical description, hands down, that you should be able to note. Note, these are figures 18.14 in the book. But you do have two key regions to note, and these two regions would be, of course, the cortex, or the adrenal cortex, which is the more superficial region. So right there, you can see it stores lipids high in cholesterol and fatty acids. Of course, again, we're dealing with steroid hormones, which are cholesterol derivatives. So this all should kind of make sense there, right? And so it manufactures the steroid hormones, and we're going to see there's three main types to focus on here. All right, the other part is the adrenal medulla. And that, of course, is this middle region here. And that's going to be producing epinephrine, norepinephrine, which hopefully you remember are the catecholamines. They're tyrosine derivatives. They are water soluble. And notice this is controlled by the sympathetic division. So during sympathetic stimulation, that's going to lead to the release of epinephrine, norepinephrine. All right, so that's what we're seeing in this little region here. All right, but notice we have the regional functions, and so right up here we can see the various zones, and you should be able to identify these zones. And I tend to, for my class, I tend to stick to this kind of high density of nuclei, low density of nuclei, and then kind of medium density of nuclei. And then there's just a complete color shift because this is different material here. This is less, it's not as saturated in lipids, so it has a different appearance. And we'll see that when I bring up some of the other histology images we're going to look at, but again, more on the lab side of things. But using images like this on my lecture quizzes and lecture exams does happen, and so it is multiple choice when I do that. But overall, this image is kind of more on the lab side of things here. And so the regional functions here, what you really need to be able to do is, can you identify like an image like this as the adrenal gland? And then if you notice, here's that high density. And when we look at the high density of nuclei region, that's the zona glomerulosa. Okay, and you need to know this. You need to know this name and get familiar with it. And you should be able to say, hey, that's part of the adrenal cortex. And the hormone that's secreted here are called mineralocorticoids, and the main one is aldosterone. So I always expect my students to note that this is aldosterone here. I certainly accept mineralocorticoid as an answer, but aldosterone is the term I'm going to be using throughout, and you should know it's secreted from zona glomerulosa. So that's going to be my focus, but again, if you're taking a different course and another instructor uses and prefers mineralocorticoid, learn that primary term there. Now, when this is secreted, or when I should say this is stimulated, it's going to target the kidneys. So aldosterone is going to target the kidneys, and it's going to do so to increase renal absorption of sodium. That's the main point you need to know. And it's going to accelerate excretion of potassium. So think bringing in sodium for exchange in potassium. And then wherever sodium goes, you're going to learn that water follows. Often this is released when we have low blood pressure. And so when that happens, this is a way of increasing blood pressure. So this one's a really big one. You're going to need to take some side notes on here. I strongly encourage you to really get the main points down for aldosterone being it's sodium uptake at the kidney and then potassium release, and then water tends to follow, so it's water reabsorption as well. And you're going to see an ADH, which we've already talked about, right? And so in the presence of ADH, this really elevates it. So again, it's another one of those synergistic hormones that we're talking about here. So ADH and aldosterone have synergistic effects because they're going to increase blood pressure. So that's what you should know. Overall function is to increase blood pressure, all right, by sodium reabsorption, potassium excretion, and then water absorption happens. So notice it's going to be stimulated by something called angiotensin 2. We're going to see this cascade. This is going to be a hormone cascade that we're going to talk about. But again, what you should know when this is going to be released, aldosterone gets released when we have high levels of potassium in our blood or low levels of sodium. Okay, and then we're also going to learn about ANP and BNP. These are called natriuretic peptides, and these are going to do the opposite. These are going to, instead of increasing blood pressure, these are going to decrease it. So when we have high blood pressure, these would be what we would be secreting to try to decrease it. All right. So that's the main point of aldosterone. So you need to get this down. Sodium, an increase in sodium reabsorption, potassium loss, and then water follows, which helps increase blood pressure. So this is released when we have low blood pressure or low sodium levels. You will learn angiotensin 2 stimulates its release as well. Okay. So that's this high density zone. You have a lot of key details. I heavily test on this. Can you name the zone? Can you name a hormone released from the zone, which would be aldosterone? Do you know the function of the zone? It's to help increase blood pressure, big picture wise. Okay, so aldosterone increases blood pressure. How? By sodium reabsorption, which water follows, and potassium excretion. All right, so then we move into the next middle region here. And so this middle region here is the zona fasciculata. And the way I always do this is I always select histology images that have this low density of nuclei. So all the little red specks would be the nuclei. And you can see that that's quite low density in comparison to up here. All right, and so the zona fasciculata, you need to know that that's going to secrete glucocorticoids, but the terms I use, so those of you following along with me, is going to be cortisol and cortisone. Those are the main terms I use with this. I certainly accept glucocorticoids as an answer. Now remember, this is stimulated by ACTH, so that's what stimulates this specific zone. So this zone is stimulated by low blood pressure. So low blood pressure will result in zona glomerulosa being stimulated. Usually it's because there's an angiotensin 2 spike, which we're going to talk about. All right, see, fall in blood sodium. If sodium is low, it usually means low blood pressure. Okay, here, this zone stimulated specifically by ACTH. What's it release? It releases cortisol and cortisone. And the function of that, or where it targets most cells. This is a stress response. So notice increases the rate of glucose and glycogen formation by the liver, releases amino acids from skeletal muscle. And if hopefully you're thinking, that doesn't sound too good, right? Why would we break down skeletal muscle? Notice releasing lipids from adipose tissue, and then here promote peripheral utilization of lipids, anti-inflammatory effects. So overall, what I want you to know about cortisol and cortisone, to kind of just summarize this is the stress metabolic hormone. All right, so in response to stress, you know, your metabolism goes up. This is going to be the hormone that does that. And so to kind of give you an idea, like waking up is kind of a stressful sort of event, right? It requires a lot of energy. You're going from a state of, you know, you're unconscious to coming out of that. We're going to release this hormone. And again, these are hormones that are maintained at certain levels, but they spike when we have stress, which is not good. So certainly this is a okay hormone to at normal levels, but we don't want spikes in this. And what causes a spike is a stress. So spike in our stress increases this. And we're going to talk about the stress response in the fourth lecture. So our final lecture coming up here, we'll discuss how these hormones are released. But the main point is you don't want to increase these, because notice it's going to form glucose and glycogen, which are our fast energy reserves, by breaking down proteins essentially off of muscle and breaking down fats from our long-term energy source. So basically it's a stress response to say, hey, get ready to go. There's a problem here. And so think stress metabolic response. Again, its stimulation is ACTH. So on a histological or a lab exam, if I highlight this range, I can easily ask, what's its name? Name a hormone secreted from this. Name the hormone that stimulates this region. The hormone that stimulates this is ACTH. Here, low blood pressure is what would usually stimulate this. Low sodium levels, high potassium levels. And this finally takes us to the last region, which I consider the middle density layer. And obviously this is where we get in transition to the adrenal medulla as well. So there's that significant color change. So it's kind of the more basal surface. It's definitely the basal surface of the adrenal cortex. And so that's the zona reticularis. Again, Same sort of questions. Can you identify this region? And do you know that it secretes androgens? Okay, and what androgens do is they target most cell. Notice that adrenal androgens stimulate the development of pubic hair in boys and girls before puberty. Androgen secretions is stimulated a little bit by ACTH. Now, the big understanding of androgens is these are primarily are precursors for testosterone and precursors to estrogen. So I don't test too heavily on androgens. Like I say, really, just know that this zona reticularis is the zone that produces androgens, and they are the precursors for testosterone and estrogens in males and females, obviously. All right. Other than that, that's the major point of this whole histology image. You really need to break this down. This is one of the images that's going to show up on multiple quizzes. It's going to show up on the lab quiz. It's going to show up on the lab exam. You need to study this one heavily. You need to know the functions of these hormones, especially aldosterone, because aldosterone and ADH, those are two hormones that elevate blood pressure in some way. So you need to start getting familiar with those. Those I test heavily on. And again, zona fasciculata, you need to know that that's going to secrete the stress metabolic hormone, which is cortisol and cortisone, and this is why it's the stress hormone. Notice it again breaks down some skeletal muscle, takes amino acids off skeletal muscles for the formation of glucose, and that means it's a stress response there because you're literally breaking down protein to just form glucose. And so this is going to bring us to the main histological images here. And so on these, as you can see, we got high density, high density, low density, back to medium, and then we get this complete shift right here where we're into the adrenal medulla. So I know this is the zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and then you got zona reticularis, and then the adrenal medulla. Okay, and that would be, again, aldosterone, which is the mineral corticoid, cortisol or cortisone, which is the glucocorticoid, the androgens, and then here epinephrine, norepinephrine. Same sort of thing, high density, low density, medium density, and then adrenal medulla. Very clear on this one. I like this one a lot more than this one, but just showing you the differences in histological layers. Here, same thing. You got high density, low density, medium density, complete shift, and you can see the names right there. This one is unique. I would not use this, so I wouldn't test you on this. If you notice, we have kind of low density, high density to medium density. I believe a lot of the histological slides in our classroom is more of this sort of slide prep. So this is a different prep, and you can see they appear differently based on the preparations. But this, I believe, is how most of the slides that we have in our classroom are prepared. But I'm going to stick to this because that's what we've been following along in the book. So I tend to stick to this one right here. All right. So this brings us to the imbalances. So we'll begin our first imbalance by talking about hyposecretions, which, if you remember, hypo means low amounts. And so these are going to be low levels of secretions, often caused by either the removal of a gland or loss of function. In fact, in some instances, taking steroids too long can actually lead to a loss of function as well. So your mineral corticoids, if you have a problem with secretions of the mineral corticoids at a low level, that would be, of course, if you remember, think aldosterone, right? That was supposed to be getting rid of, reabsorbing sodium and getting rid of potassium. So in this case, if you are having low levels of aldosterone, that means you're going to have low sodium levels. That means you're going to have high potassium levels. There's acidosis is common. That's not something I stress at this time. We'll talk about that much later. But notice low blood pressure because, as I said, it's important. Aldosterone helps regulate blood pressure. Tremors of muscles because, of course, you have an imbalance of sodium and potassium. We know sodium-potassium pump is important for neural system and, of course, muscular system and cells just in general. And then polyuria, which means just frequent urination, would be common with this. So if I listed off these sort of conditions here, would you be able to identify that that's low secretions of aldosterone? So you can put, instead of having low mineral corticoid, you can put low aldosterone over here, which is usually what I would put on my exam, would be low aldosterone. All right. But similarly, the other big hyposecretion that we could have would be that of cortisol. And when we talk low levels of cortisol, again, removal of the gland or loss of a function of the gland can happen. But in this case, hypoglycemia, which is low blood glucose levels, could occur because, again, cortisol, which is often the stress response that produces glucose, if you're not producing it, it is needed. Again, it's a stress response, but it's needed throughout the day to kind of just keep us in balance. Notice when we don't have that, we get low blood glucose levels. Notice a depressed immune system, so this is helpful for our immune system. Loss of appetite, nausea, vomiting, and weight loss tend to be common. Now, in most cases, when you're talking about hyposecretions and it's talking about removal of the gland, if we remove the gland, both of these would be kind of together, and often that's known as Addison's disease. So Addison's disease you should associate as low levels of aldosterone and low levels of cortisol, and that's going to just be major issues overall with the adrenal cortex. So notice weight loss, muscle weakness, low blood pressure, constant fatigue would be things often associated with Addison's disease. So really study this, understand how or why, if you had low secretions of aldosterone, that this is what you would expect. It's pretty much saying, hey, I know what aldosterone does, so if I don't have aldosterone, what would end up happening? Well, you can't reabsorb sodium, so expect low sodium levels. You can't exchange potassium, so expect a buildup of potassium. Like I said, acidosis isn't one of the key points you would need to focus on, but I've stressed blood pressure with this, so notice low blood pressure should make sense. All right, those minimums would be on there to identify this. All right, but associate Addison's disease with a complete adrenal cortex issue. All right, now we can look at the hypersecretion side, and the hypersecretion side is going to be high levels of secretions here. And so on the hypersecretion side, we can have mineralocorticoid secretion. So think about that. Again, caused by a tumor that's actually going to stimulate and increase activity. Or there's actually a disease called aldosteronism. So you should be able to recognize the term aldosteronism on the exam. And if we think about this, if this is hypersecretion of the mineralocorticoid, just think, what does aldosterone do? Well, it helps with increasing sodium. So you would expect some hypernatrium. You'd expect low levels of potassium. So we're excreting lots more potassium. If we had acidosis with the other one, we're going to have alkalosis. So obviously there is hydrogen ion exchange that's associated with this that I'm really not going to get into yet. So I would worry about that later. We'll be getting into that hydrogen exchange when we actually talk about pH balance when we get more towards the urinary system. All right, but again, if this was associated with raising blood pressure, high blood pressure would be seen. Notice still weakness in muscles because we don't have the right sodium-potassium balance. And if you don't have balance, it's going to cause your muscles to really get damaged because, again, there's not the right balance of sodium and potassium, so they're firing improperly. They're not functioning appropriately. It's not going to be good. All right, but overall, so that's mineralocorticoid or aldosteronism. Be able to recognize this. I don't do too much with this besides knowing that it's aldosteronism because you should know what aldosterone does. I've been stressing this, and that's what, of course, this entire lecture is on. Now, cortisol is the other big one, and this one you should know is Cushing's syndrome, okay? And there could be hypersecretion of the androgens. I don't focus too much on that side. So know this is Cushing, all right? No Addison's. Definitely know those two diseases. And then you need to be able to spot, would this be if I listed these things off, would you know it was a hyposecretion of aldosterone? Would you know it was a hyposecretion if I listed these things off? Would you know it's a hyposecretion of cortisol? So now we have a hypersecretion of cortisol. And so notice hyperglycemia. So your body is building up sugars at a rapid rate, and that can lead to diabetes. Again, I've stressed that this is the stress hormone, so notice a depressed immune system. In fact, I can kind of share a story with you about how stress can actually impact the immune system. I had a event that I had to take my brother to, and he was taking an exam. The exam was only supposed to take about 2.5 hours. He ended up spending about 4 on there, and I had to go to an event that was like a 2-hour drive. So I had to drive him home an hour, and then I had to drive another 1.5 hours. And so as he's taking the exam, I'm realizing, oh my gosh, I'm going to be missing a lot of this event now. And so I could just feel my heart racing and all that thing. So basically cortisol levels were through the roof. And right off of that and after that, I could actually feel the fact that I was actually starting to get a cold sore that started to develop. I could feel it in my lip right away, and I knew it was from the stress. And anytime that I get to that hyper of stress, there are times where I actually feel like a tingling in the lip region starts to develop, which I instantly know, oh man, I better start putting some treatment on, because that's usually the sign that a cold sore develops. So stress definitely needs to be held in check. I have firsthand experience that, I can actually feel stress causing immune problems. So in this case, Cushing's syndrome, having a hypersecretion, notice, still causes this. Notice muscle weakness and atrophy, because literally tissue protein is being destroyed to form glucose and glycogen. Impaired wound healing, and then redistribution of adipose. This one's really unique. So to the face, to the neck, and abdominal region. So adipose gets kind of distributed to your upper extremities, and it looks kind of unique when this starts to happen for individuals that have Cushing's syndrome. Also with this, there can be emotional effects of euphoria and all the way from euphoria to depression, so large swings, because again, this is steroid balance. And steroids, this is why we don't typically, and doctors don't want to prescribe steroid anti-inflammatory drugs, because we have to keep our body in balance. And this is a perfect example of how important not only keeping stress in balance, but having something like Cushing's syndrome, how impactful it is to the body. So really know these. I like testing on imbalances. It shows me that you really know the organ really well, and you know the effects of the hormones, because you're able to think in both directions on the hyposecretion and how that would impact the body to hyper, and what the actual mid ground is supposed to be. So really work through this quite a bit. All right, the final gland to just kind of throw in there, because I didn't have a great spot to really end this or have this gland kind of lead off. But it does bring us to the final gland to note for this lecture, which is the pineal gland. And really what you need to know is we have a collection of cells. I don't even use this as a histology site, so I don't get caught up on it. But you should know pineal sites. If you see that term, I would expect you to know those are cells of the pineal gland. This is just typical anatomy concepts at this point, knowing what a cell name is, right? And hopefully you know the hormone. We've talked about the pineal gland. That was at the end of last semester, right? So Anatomy 1 ended with the nervous system. You should have mentioned this region right here being the pineal gland, and knowing that they, of course, secrete melatonin. Melatonin, you should know, is the tryptophan derivative, right? We talked about that, but it's the tryptophan derivative that influences circadian rhythms, which, of course, are the sleep and wake cycles. So hopefully you understood that one. I don't spend a lot of time on this. I expect students to kind of have this down. If you didn't know this, it's really basic to realize pineal sites are the cells that secrete melatonin. Melatonin is important for our sleep and wake cycles. And obviously, in humans, our peak levels will be at night. That's where we start to get drowsy, because melatonin secretion starts to increase. So a lack of sunlight leads to melatonin production. And then obviously when we have the highest amount of sun, which is right around noonish, that's where we're going to be the most awake and have the lowest levels of melatonin. So it's regulated, pretty much influenced by our sleep cycles. And that's why it's so challenging. Anyone who works night shifts, you know how challenging this can be, because, of course, it's really easy to have imbalances of melatonin and how much that light can influence you. All right, and so that is it for this lecture. Lecture number 3 is done. There was a lot to do, obviously, with knowing the adrenal cortex. Quite a bit to break down. A lot of lecture content has been covered. Like I said, really knowing your major glands, especially hands down, the pancreas, the adrenal gland, and really the thyroid gland. Those are some major glands that I test on. Calcium, blood calcium balance, blood glucose balance. Those are huge concepts that you need to know. Blood pressure. So make sure you focus on these heavily. This is the bulk of the lecture and the material that I cover. So we have one more lecture to go. I believe it's going to be broken into 2 parts. So we're down to hopefully about 45 minutes to an hour left to close out Chapter 18. I know it's been a long lecture. Hands down, it's a heck of a way to start the second semester here. It's really, really challenging material, hands down. I don't think the content and what all of the stuff does is necessarily super challenging on the aspect of, hey, insulin causes an uptake of blood glucose. I just think there's a ton of content that you have to sort through, a ton of reorganization. That's what's going to make this challenging, which is why you need to practice a lot and stay consistent with it. Like I said, I don't think the content itself is that overly challenging. It's just we covered a lot of ground, and you have a lot of organization and keeping in track. Oh, which hormone is this? Is this a water soluble? Is this a lipid soluble? All of those things make it challenging, but try to stick to the biggest pictures that you can of each hormone and each gland that we've talked about. So good luck on this. Keep focus. I know it's super challenging in the long, big scheme of things because of how much content there is, but certainly if you have questions, please ask. All right, we'll see you for the last lecture of Chapter 18, which will be lecture number 4. Like I said, likely broken down into 2 parts. I hope that's all I have to get through. Take care, everyone. We'll see you over there.